All right, so I am pleased to introduce our moderator for this evening, Executive Director of Colorado ASCD, Dr. Robin Wisniewski. Robin.
Hello and welcome. This is Education Issues in Focus. It's a conversation with policymakers, and we're pleased that you've joined us tonight as we talk with policymakers about issues that are important to Colorado educators. Our agenda includes remarks by Katie Anthus, Colorado Commissioner of Education, and David Griffith, Senior Policy Advisor for ASCD. After their remarks, I'll pose questions to the policymaker panel that includes Jane Goff, a member of the Colorado State Board of Education, and Brent Kinman, Operations Director for the Colorado House Minority Office. Also on the policymaker panel, we have Julie Duvall representing Senator Bennett's office and Senator Gardner via a pre-recorded video. And I just want to test, Julie, because you joined us. Were we able to hear Julie?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great.
Okay,
Excellent.
perfect. Thank you. And in addition, we have three teachers, a panel of three teachers who will reflect on the comments of the policymakers, highlighting the impact that policy solutions might have in the classroom. The teachers include Anita Gandhi, a middle school teacher from Colorado Springs, Sean Wybrant, a high school teacher and 2016 Colorado Teacher of the Year, and Deborah Norby Colgate, an elementary teacher from Salida. Was Deborah able to join, do we know? Okay, I don't think so. So we will have Sean Wybrant and Anita Gandhi. So I will start by turning it over to Dr. Anthus now for her opening remarks. And Katie, you might be on mute.
Okay, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, yes.
Okay, wonderful. Hi, welcome everyone. I'm thrilled to be here tonight. As was mentioned, I'm the Commissioner of Education here in Colorado and have been so for a little over a year. And I really just want to say thank you to ASCD. I really appreciate having these conversations and having them in a bunch of different ways and venues. So this is an excellent way to sort of have that policy discussion and have teachers be able to reflect on these policy discussions and conversations. I really see the Colorado Department of Education's role as trying to bridge what policymakers do and then how we support districts in implementing those policies. So sometimes we're sort of a broker or a translator to helping our districts really support all the students and make sure that our public policies are being implemented to the best of our abilities. We also at CDEC, our role is giving information to policymakers. And we have a wonderful two teachers here to talk about how that plays out in the classroom, but I have also wanted to do more of that in my role as commissioner, and I've started a teacher cabinet that advises me and makes sure that I stay grounded, and Sean is on that cabinet as well as 19 other teachers. So these types of discussions and collaborations are very critical to ensure that the intended outcomes of policies are really met and that we're not passing policies that have too many unintended consequences. So that's really some of the work I see myself doing and the Department of Education doing in partnership with policymakers and teachers. I know that Colorado, along with the rest of the nation, are facing some critical challenges and opportunities in public education. And I know we're going to get the chance to talk about those today, but some of the ones we think about a lot here in Colorado are, you know, what is appropriate funding levels for education and what do we need to invest in our public education system to make sure we're getting the return on investment? What we're having some, just with other places in the country, we are having some teacher shortages in Colorado. And so really thinking about how we support, encourage, recruit teachers to come into the field, because they are the lifeblood of our education system. And we need to make sure we're supporting, compensating, and encouraging that profession. So we're embarking on some work at the state level as well. And then really supporting our historically underserved students. And how do we close some of those persistent achievement gaps? And I really see that in ways that we have to, it's not just, we have to work in partnership with other sectors to support our students and make sure that underserved students are supported in many, many ways, even before they get to school, so that they're ready to learn when they get to school. So I find that there's no silver bullet to these answers. I always feel a little bit bad for policymakers, because they're sort of looked to as, you know, can you help us solve this? Can you help us fix this? And really, I don't see a silver bullet. I see a lot of hard work, a lot of collaboration, a lot of day in and day out work with our fabulous educators in Colorado, in partnership with our policymakers, to really come up with solutions. So that's what this type of a dialogue can help us do. And so I, for one, am very appreciative of that. So with that, I will turn it back over to me. Robin.
Thank you. That is perfect. Thank you so much for your remarks, Dr. Anthus. You've set a great tone for this conversation, and it really inspires us all to think carefully about policy and its roles in our lives as educators. So I want to give the opportunity for David Griffith to do the same thing, the Senior Policy Advisor for ASCD. David, please help us set the stage for the panel by providing your perspective on education policy from your experience with ASCD.
Sure, thank you. Ditto to everything Katie Anthus said. I would begin with. No, I would. Yes, I want to. Well, I want to commend the Colorado ASCD and Robin and Jill and Nancy and Siri and the rest of the affiliate for taking this on and having this event. I think it's critically important. And I also want to commend and thank Katie Anthus and Jane Goff and the senators' offices and your legislative leaders who are participating as well. It's really critically important for them to be involved. You can't have a conversation or a dialogue without that piece of it. I guess I'd show my age a little bit, but saying, you know, this is really important to get educators involved in these policy conversations, because I think if you look back at when the No Child Left Behind Act was enacted, those many years ago, a lot of the problems, and I think Katie alluded to this, the unintended consequences of many of those provisions could have been ameliorated had educators been more involved in the conversations and more involved in the development of the law itself. And fortunately, educators since then have become much more involved, and I think you see the fruition of that in the Every Student Succeeds Act, that I think is much more was a collaborative effort and much more of a partnership in trying to make sure that these federal education policies were going to work in the unique circumstances of each state. I think you've got a great program on here today, speaking about both the federal level, at the state level, both the legislature and the State Board of Education. Those are really important avenues. We've had the state plans as far as ESSA is concerned, and a lot of the collaboration across the states, and in particular in Colorado, in putting those together. But really now there's a lot of work being done in the states, both with as it relates to ESSA and also just other education reforms. And it's really important that educators, again, have that dialogue with policymakers. So policymakers understand where educators are coming from, and educators understand and feel like their voices are being heard in the development of these things. And it's really important. I just saw Bill Gates was talking about the Common Core. The Gates Foundation was talking about the Common Core the other day, and one of the aha takeaways they had was the importance of getting buy-in at the local level, particularly from teachers and principals and parents as well. And that was a lesson, again, another lesson learned in more recent past. So you've got a great Colorado leadership. I really appreciate that they're here listening to your members about what's going on. I find it really interesting. I'm really going to be interested to see what the funding discussion is about, because so many times educators just accept whatever funding levels they get and make do. And so I think it'd be great to have a conversation about, what does that impact look like at the district or school or classroom level, and how we might be able to either make more efficiencies or shift funding or prioritize funding to make it work even better. So I look forward to the conversation. And again, thank you for doing this. It's a real benefit, and we want to, again, emulate what's going on in Colorado around the country. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, David. And your remarks also really help us frame our discussion with the panel. And it's reassuring that it's important that educators understand policy so that their voices can be heard. So we really appreciate that. So we'll start with our first question for the panel. I'll read the question, and then I'll ask Jane to start, and then Brent to go after that. So our first question is related to state funding, which was brought up by both of you, Katie and David. In the past 10 years, many school districts across the state of Colorado have been forced to cut their budgets significantly. And this has been due to changes in state funding. So what are some policy solutions that you could support that would help state funding for education become more balanced, more equal, and more consistent? Jane, let's start with you.
Well, first of all, good evening, everyone.
Good evening. Jane, we heard your good evening, but we don't hear you now.
Hello?
Hello, now we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm so sorry. I am happy to join you tonight. I really appreciate this invitation. And as I was starting to say, my membership, my affiliation with ASCD goes back to, I believe it was my second year of teaching. So I am a longtime supporter and advocate and affiliate member here of yours, and I just so much appreciate everything the organization has been doing for many years in helping teachers develop, learn new things, and work with other professionals as well. Yes, school funding, is that what everyone's talking about these days? As far as policy making is concerned, one thing that the state board's position around school funding is that we influence policy because of our interactions with the legislators. So I'm sure that Brent will be able to talk about this a little bit deeper, but we have a good relationship with our legislators. The state board appoints or designates 2 state board members, one from either party, to act as contacts during the legislative session for the members of the board. So what we get to do is follow legislation that's proposed. We have discussions among ourselves, and sometimes we take a position, and sometimes we don't. We decide to monitor a bill as it's moving through the process. But one of the other things that the board does annually, and I assume we will get started on that pretty soon for the next session, is that we set legislative priorities. And one of the 5 categories that applies to is school finance. Basically, what we had in place for last year was pretty simple and pretty straightforward. Our interest for state finance, school finance, is that we have an equitable, comprehensive, and predictable finance system that will provide permanent solutions to our funding challenges. optimizes opportunity for all students, and ensures the state has flexibility, which is a parenthetical expression after that would be the maintain the integrity of local control. So legislation that moves through that is connected to the long bill at the end of the session, where the allocations are more clearly lined out, it's of interest to us, of course, that our districts are able to continue to plan programs, develop their own budgets, and set their path according to what their needs and aspirations are. We will always encourage a development of school finance system that clearly communicates with and engages the public around this topic. I do believe personally, from my own experiences as a voter and a citizen of Colorado, that we have gotten better about this. I do believe, as a whole, our population has become better informed about how schools are funded. And this last couple of years in particular, a lot more sophistication of the awareness and the knowledge around our challenges. We also want to take into account, along with the local control idea, is that we have a state system where both state and local capacity is taken into account. As you all know, there are areas of the state that are differently equipped as far as their tax base is concerned and the amount of revenue that they can bring in locally. So those are the main points around our pretty general, but we think it's pretty forthright system for state school finance. I would like to remind everyone, and I'm sure Brent can give detail on this as well, there was a bill passed last session that created an interim committee on school finance, and their task is to study school finance, and they are getting their knowledge, they're getting the information, and then hopefully they will be able to analyze and discuss some parts of our current system and see if they can come up with some means of addressing perhaps, we hope, a different way, more equitable, more comprehensive way of funding our schools. One thing that has come up in the past as well, I believe they might be talking about it, is a discussion of some pupil count options. We have had this discussion going back 10 years or more. Studies have been done that rather than having a single count day for the students in the year, there might be more than that. There might be a different way of combining or grouping school kids so that a different type of count, which would impact the funding that way. But right now, that committee is scheduled to next meet on November the 9th, and those hearings and meetings are always open. They are also broadcast, which can be accessed through the Colorado General Assembly website. So that's what I would say around our take on school finance. We're all involved in it, and we all look to the legislature with much appreciation for that very difficult task that they do every year.
Jane, that's a perfect transition to Brent. Brent, what are some solutions you could support that would help state funding for education become more balanced, and equal, and consistent?
Thank you for having me this evening. I was asked by Representative Jim Wilson, whom I trust many of you all know, who was a teacher, a coach, a superintendent, and now a legislator, who knows more about Colorado education. I guess he has more of that knowledge in his little finger than I do throughout. Nevertheless, I very much appreciated Jane's remarks, or survey of some of the issues we're facing. I'm going to go by three parts, talk a little bit of background on education funding, and a little bit to then the question of balance, equal and consistent, and then some policy stuff. And even though I don't consider myself a dry speaker, some of this is fairly dry stuff, so I'll try to pep it up a little bit. Maybe I'll stand on my head. Here we go. As you know, Colorado's annual budget's comprised of four sources. Three of them are major. We get federal funding, about 30%, cash funds, 27%, reapportioned funds, that's minuscule, and then general funds, 37%. And we get a fair bit of federal funding for education and other sources. But when it comes to decision making and the legislature, it's this general fund that sort of comes to the fore. Nevertheless, general fund contributions to education are about 56% of the money spent every year. The rest comes from various sources, including local mill levies, property taxes, federal funds, lease payments, and so forth. Now, I know the question related to 10 years, but I went back 12 because I wanted to get a small glimpse of issues prior to when the recession hit. In that year, in 2006 and 7, general fund spending for K-12 education was about $2.8 billion. This past year, we allocated a little over $4.1 billion. That's an increase of 42%. That sounds impressive, but when we factor in inflation over the past dozen years, the increase works down to 18% in inflation-adjusted dollars. Meanwhile, during that same period, we've seen our student population rise about 15%. As a result of the recession, and if you've been teaching very long, you surely felt the pinch of it. If you have money in para, you definitely saw the pinch of it. Education spending, which had averaged nearly 6% annual increase in 2006, 7, and 8, was dramatically reduced by 2 years of cuts totaling almost 13%. Beginning in 2012 and 13 and up to the present, general fund increases for education have resumed, averaging about 6.4% a year. Yet if we factor in inflation, we only reach pre-recession levels of general fund education spending in 2015 and 16. So it's only been a couple years where education has really begun to resume some of the progress that it attained in the middle of the aughts. Today we're spending more on education than ever before, and people have different opinions about spending even more, especially when results are mixed. Under the latest set of scores available on the Colorado Department of Education website, only 69% of students scored as proficient or advanced in reading on the TCAP. That number shrinks to 54% when it came to writing. And considering the all-important categories of math and science, students fare no better. In math, the success rate is 56%. For science, it is 50%. We graduate about 80% of students from high school in 4 years. And I would say that people understand that education costs money, but there are those who question what the public is getting for its money. Finally, when it comes to education dollars, and I'm trying to give you a big picture here so that you can begin to appreciate some of the tensions felt among legislators come budget time. When it comes to general fund dollars, you should know that K-12 education has a competitor. In 2006 and 7, we spent a much larger percentage of general fund money on K-12 education than we did on healthcare and human services, about 42% to 29%. But since then, healthcare and human services as a percentage of general fund dollars has risen considerably, averaging 34.5% of the general fund budget over the past 5 years. In 2006 and 7, we had two K-12 students for every Medicaid recipient. Using the latest numbers, we now have 1.4 Medicaid recipients for every one student. Medicaid enrollment has increased 257% since 2006 and just over 22% a year for the past 10 years. It's safe to say that education is competing with healthcare especially Medicaid, for general fund dollars. Now, concerning the question about balanced, equal, and consistent, here's the thing. Again, as a background, education funding already attempts to achieve some balance in its funding formula. As most of you know, total program funding, that number that so many of you are familiar with, has a state component, a state share, a local share, and these things called factors. The factors is the technical term for costs peculiar to a given district, like the cost of living, personnel cost, at-risk enrollment, online enrollment, these things that represent the state's attempt to achieve some balance. In addition, there's what's called categorical program funding that takes into account small attendance centers, special ed, vocational education, gifted and talented, and the English Language Proficiency Act. Again, it's not as if the state is unaware of imbalance and is doing nothing about it. The question is it doing enough? And here we begin to get to the nub of the problem. If we stay with the funding problem, the state has a structural funding problem. Some of you have heard of the Gallagher Amendment. In 1982, we passed it, and it said that 55% of local education funding was supposed to come from business property taxes, 45% from residential property taxes. But over the past several years, while residential values have gone up, Gallagher only lets them go up so far until it requires a mill levy tax cut, a property tax cut, that can only later be reinstated by voter approval. And lots of voters, as you well know, don't approve. And politicians, knowing the voters won't approve, don't propose the increases. It's this quirk in funding structure that results in well-to-do districts, for example, very often having very low property taxes and still getting funding from the state that might otherwise go to poorer and rural districts. My own fear, I suppose, is that education funding will simply muddle through until the people at large demand a much larger structural overhaul to the system. But Colorado voters,
Brent, if you don't mind, I'd really love to get the teachers' responses to what you're saying. This is really great background.
No worries, and
okay.
And perhaps in the course of those questions, I can give you a couple policy formulations I have here.
Great. So thank you, Jane and Brent, for your responses. Let's turn to the teachers to get their reflections on what they heard from the two policymakers. Anita, can we start with you, and then we'll hear from Sean?
Hi, I'm Anita Gandhi. I teach French at middle school. So some of the things that I picked up on the conversations are, Jane, you talked about pupil count options, and Brent, you talked about a lot of factors that are involved in how districts obtain funding or how the state does funding. Mm-hmm. Some of the things that we see in the trenches at the teacher level, or where I am, are things like decisions that are being made about testing. And our starting point is always what is best for students and what is best for children. So when the funding filters down to our schools, I'm not sure that the decisions that are being made are necessarily best for students. For example, last year and the year before at my school, our students went through a series of state tests that were probably 3 or 4 times where they were being tested over the course of the year. And so we really see a lot of testing fatigue at our school. And I'm not sure that the results that we're seeing are representative of what our student population is. So when we talk about, the proficiency scores, I wonder what can we do to find a different system so that students are excited to test, or they are not testing as frequently as they are, so that when they are, it's very meaningful to them. And another piece of information that I'd like to address is the pupil count options. what we have seen is very little change in terms of the money that our school receives per pupil. And another thing that we see very often is a lot of scrambling to make sure that our pupil counts are accurate. I'll give you an example that happened to me just this year. I had a student who one day just didn't show up to my class, and it turned out that her parents wanted her to transfer to another middle school, and the middle school would only allow her to transfer if she transferred prior to the October count. So Jane, your suggestion about re-looking at the pupil counts and maybe having different options there, I think that's a really good idea. How's my time?
Okay, I'm hoping I'm on. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yes, yes, it's a, gosh, 25-year-old conversation. So I do appreciate it, and thank you, Indeed. It's nice to meet you. I'm a former French teacher as well. So I understand a lot of where your viewpoint is coming from on both of the major topics you brought up. As far as pupil count is concerned, there's been discussion, and then I will say none of us should be projecting that the same types of options will become the new options that are presented. But there was talk at one time about doing 2 pupil count periods of time rather than just one in October. As you might be aware, that the special education pupil count is not due or complete until December the 1st. So there is some extra time allocated for that. The other thing to keep in mind is that how pupil count impacts the level of funding goes back to the factors that Brent mentioned. So districts are allotted a certain amount of money based on their special ed population, based on their gifted and talented population, English language learners, and so forth. In some ways, the state level funding formula, which is what that is, matches a little bit of how the federal funds are allocated as well. Other options and other issues around the pupil count is exactly your example. What happens when the students are there for the October count? So your district, for example, receives the allocated amount of money for that student, including the base amount that is set for each student in the state, and categoricals, which are the other categories, are added in. Suppose that student then leaves your district, goes to another district, and yet there has only been one allocation of money. So when districts are, the second receiving district is receiving the money that was allocated to the first district, and there's not an interchange of money there afterwards. That's one of the issues that has been talked about. There's also been conversation about looking at kindergarten, for example. Half-day kindergarten, full-day kindergarten, that's a different amount. So what's the ratio of money to the time that the students are counted as kindergartners? How to adjust what's known as the full-time equivalent. So what is a full-time student versus not full-time student, and how do you allocate the dollars toward that? One of the more recent considerations around that has been with high school. If you have students in a concurrent enrollment program, you have certain obligations to your partnering higher ed institution, for example. How does the formula get impacted by that growing number of students pretty much everywhere in the state? So I would imagine that the interim committee will be learning about and talking about and discussing and analyzing things like that when they get down to making a recommendation, if legislation is going to be coming that has those recommendations in it. The testing options, yes, we still all talk about that quite a bit. As far as funding is concerned, there is a certain amount that is set every year for the cost of the assessments that districts receive based on the number of students being tested. The issue of too much testing, I think we're all still working through trying to really determine on a fair basis if we're to keep two columns going. We have a state assessment system, and we have districts giving assessments as well. And so within the districts themselves, they will probably be doing and have been doing an awful lot of talking about where do we adjust this as far as the time needed for the preparation and the actual administration of tests. One thing that I always like to remind people is two things, actually. Making changes as we have done over the last 3 to 4 years. When the system has changed, we're looking at a new set of state assessments coming in 2019, and some will begin next year, this next spring, with our new 9th grade test. Those do present different scenarios. They are shorter. They have been, they're being worked on and developed now. There will be field tests with those. So people will be able to get a real clear handle on what that looks like. Literally, what does it mean to live this kind of schedule? And we also want to always consider, and districts work this out as well, what about the technology that is needed in order to conduct the online portion of any assessments? So I appreciate the questions very much. I hope I've been sort of helpful in some of the details around it. Lots more conversation to come. And again, I want to reiterate, having the voice of educators in these conversations is critical. And the board has a real desire to make sure that's as ample and sufficient as it can be.
Thank you, Jane. Sean, do you have thoughts to add in response to this funding question?
Oh, I always have thoughts. Funding questions. One of the things that well, first off, thanks for having me on, and thanks for bringing educators into the forum so that we can have a response. That's really important. Thank you for providing an opportunity for us to have that voice, and thank you to those of you in the legislative side of things for listening to our voice. So, wanted to say that. There were a couple of things. I would echo a lot of the things that Anita said. One of the interesting things that I've had the opportunity to do as the Colorado teacher here is to go out to different places and to see the kinds of environments that different kids are learning in. And when we talk about, whether or not kids are prepared for classes, we try to think about, are their basic needs being met? Are they well fed? Are they coming from a safe location? Are they coming into a space that's actually ready for them? And I would say that when we talk about equitable funding, and I know that we're trying to balance things, and I know that we are also trying to make sure that we have an equitable, comprehensive, and predictable funding formula, but we have some schools in the state that literally are falling apart. So when we have schools that kids are going into where you can literally see through the cracks in the foundation of the school, like that's a pretty significant problem. And before we get into conversations about technology, and before we get into conversations about some of the other things that we would like to put in, especially when we talk about innovation and 21st century learning, I think that it's really important that we also get to the point where kids are in safe schools, and we need to work on that a little bit. So as we're looking at the balance thing, like that's something that we really need to keep in mind. When we talk about the cost of assessments and whether or not there's too much assessment, oftentimes, as was pointed out, it's a district deciding that they're going to administer assessments. I think that sometimes we have districts that haven't been trained well enough in terms of looking at how much assessment they really need to do their formative testing to make sure that kids are prepared for what that end assessment is. And so from a policy perspective, something that we might be able to do is provide better leadership training for districts across the state so they understand what their options really are. And that's districts, not only from like the superintendent level on down at the central administration, but also from the principal level, right, and stuff. When we talk about the new tests that are coming out, one of the things that I would love for us to have some questions about is whether or not we're assessing the right things. Because sometimes I think that people assume that the assessments that we're giving are the right assessments, but sometimes we use assessments for multiple purposes when they really should only be used for one. So an example of this is when we give kids an assessment on technology, on a computer, we need to be really clear about whether or not the kids require access skills in order to be able to get to the content of the test, or whether or not we are in fact assessing them instead of the content on whether or not they can use, you know, the technology and the computers. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's something that we need to maybe have some conversations about, because I know that sometimes we have really smart kids who would be able to answer the assessment in one way. Now, whether that's on a computer or whether that's in a performance or whether that's in some other more authentic kind of test, where kids would be able to do that, but because of the format of the test, they're not able to show their best. So would just want to put that out there. And then I would also want to point out that one of the things from a policy perspective that I think that we could really do some work on is access to early childhood education. Because the kids who have access to a preschool, the kids who have access to early learning opportunities, those kids have potentially better access skills, better knowledge skills, better understanding of how school works than kids who don't have access. And we have a lot of work to do, I think, in the alignment of our early childhood education programs. When we look at the way that preschools are set up and who has access and who doesn't, and how that prepares kids for kindergarten, and the kids who don't get that, how it might not be preparing them, I think that's something that we should look at, as well as the way that we onboard our English language learners, our refugee students, our second language learners, before we have them go and try to do a high-level assessment. And so those are all policy touch points that I think that we could potentially look at as opportunities to grow our system, to make sure that it really is something that the rest of the country would really want to emulate.
Perfect. Thank you, Sean. So we have, we're going to move to question 2. There's 3 parts to this question. I'm just going to focus on one part of the question. And it's how education policy might initiate or support innovation with regard to teacher recruitment and retention. And Julie, we haven't heard from you yet, so if you don't mind, we'd like to hear what you think about this first from the federal level. And it's how education policy might initiate or support innovation with regard to teacher recruitment and retention.
Sure. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Great. Excellent. Well, I think, first of all, I'll echo just a few things that others have said, but we'll get to the point of the question as fast as possible. But one piece I want to echo that the last 2 speakers and teachers just mentioned is how important it is in the work of ASCD in focusing on P20 and the entire spectrum. I think we right now in the Senate, and Michael in particular, are very interested in looking at early learning opportunities, as well as the whole child and some of those authentic opportunities where we can engage in other issues facing communities, especially rural communities where recruitment and retention of teachers seems to be, it's a problem everywhere, but especially in our rural communities. And one thing that I'll mention here, which is not at all ready for prime time in the policymaking space, but we're gearing up probably later this week or early next week to look at expanding the child tax credit and looking at how do we get more money into the hands of parents so that more effective work or more effective resources are put into families' hands so that they can do what they need to do, and we take off maybe some of the pressure off of our school systems and education system. Specific to recruitment and retention of teachers, I think, there's no question that no in-school factor has a greater effect on student performance than teacher quality, and we need excellent teachers in all of our schools. there are many young people who would like to choose teaching as a career and decide not to because they leave college with a staggering amount of debt, which is another issue, not for this panel, but to figure out how we're going to address the assault on Pell Grants and other student loan programs. Or they hesitate to pursue a career in teaching because of low starting salaries and other challenges. And I think there's a role in the Senate for how we reduce the cost of college so that young people are less constrained in their career choices. And then also teaching is a challenging profession, and maybe the most challenging profession. And it's more challenging today than it was a decade ago. And I think that continues to be an area of complication. And accomplished teachers, many of whom we've heard to tonight, deserve opportunities to advance careers at a pace that meets or beats other professional fields. And we ought to treat teaching in that way. And we ought to hold teachers up to be the professionals and the heroes in our communities that they are. School systems can use federal, state, and other funds to create programs that put a premium on this opportunity for teachers to become education leaders without having to leave the classroom. One example, Michael secured an amendment in ESSA, which is the act that I think David and some other folks mentioned earlier, that supports teacher leadership opportunities while still allowing teachers to remain in the classroom. And then the last point that I'll make is how the United States, what we need to do to invest and maintain in teacher development and training. The current administration, President Trump, his initial proposal eliminates Title II funding, which is the federal statute that supports these programs. The Senate budget that we're working on right now that passed out of committee provides $2 billion in this funding. So I think at best we're hopeful that some or all of these funds in Title II would remain, but it's certainly a fight that we have on our hands.
Thank you so much, Julie, and thank you for representing Senator Bennett. We also have a video with a pre-recorded response from Senator Gardner that's just a couple of minutes, and Nancy will play that right now in response to this question about teacher recruitment and retention. Nancy, have you gotten to the spot to play?
Let me try that one more time. Sorry.
Okay.
Technical difficulty there. One moment.
Okay.
Well,
It's not working?
let me try it again here.
Okay. Try one more time, and if not, it'll be available on our website.
Is it not playing for you?
It's not playing.
Oh, I'm so sorry. We will make the video available after the event on the CoASCD website. So.
Okay. All right. Perfect. Well, we will thank Senator Gardner in advance to seeing his video, or after he already made it. So let's move back to Jane, and then we'll have a few minutes left for Brent, if you have something to add with regard to support, with regard to teacher recruitment and retention. Jane?
Thank you. I want to reiterate what a couple of you have said, and that is that while this is truly a critical situation right now in Colorado's rural districts. That's not to say that it's not something every district of any size is feeling the impact of. We have a Front Range in general situation where some of the bleeding has stopped, except it's not where we would like it to be as yet. Some of the areas that are certain content areas are feeling the pinch a little bit more than others right now. We're always on the lookout for science teachers and math teachers, STEM teachers in general. Probably it's better to say a general category now. We need STEM teachers. And in some cases, world language teachers. I have talked to several of my current and former colleagues who are rather concerned about the inability of the pipeline to supply what would be ideal for us in all of those areas. Special education, of course, is another one. It is dependent on the size of the district in so many cases. One thing before I forget, I don't want to forget this, is to draw your attention to the fact that there was another bill that was passed in our Colorado legislature last session. It basically directs CDE and CDHE, the Higher Ed and Department of Ed, to develop a strategic plan to address educator shortages. And we also might highlight the fact that teachers are the bulk of the push, but we are also needing to be prepared to really bring in some highly qualified leaders in our schools. So it does impact not only classroom, but the building principalship and other district leaders. One thing that CDE has, and I'm not planning at all to steal any of Katie's thunder, but the establishment of the teacher cabinet, I think, has been one of the most needed and most appreciated steps for our state to take. Yes, Sean, thank you so much. And we have such a good potential to have the conversations there that really do count, those that bring the ground into the discussion. It's those people that are doing the work every day that understand where the needs are and how teacher development, support, and of course resources necessary to do the best job is also a part of this. It's very hard to separate the human beings who actually have the jobs from the tools that they need to do the best work they can. So we're always talking with tangents in mind. I think that one of the things that through our wonderful commissioner and early conversations with her, the board has come to some thinking about where do we want to go as part of our mission and what are our goals as a board. And one of the key areas is in teacher quality, teacher recruitment. And we're looking to be able to sit down and look at all of our ed prep support systems. What do we have in the ways of how is our higher ed, how are our higher ed programs doing with their programs and in supporting it? Rules, the state board does promulgate rules based on legislation, but we also do that as a policy measure anyway. And some business practices, which brings in the idea of what is our process looking like around licensure. Is there a way we could make that, I don't know, I don't want to say easier. We don't want to set low bars, but just streamline or make efficient in some different ways for people. We have flexible pathways to ed licensure in our state. We have alternative programs. We have emergency authorizations that can be given, substitute authorizations and so forth. I think the goal is to have people that are going to be great, really want to teach, get attracted to the idea, and then we find and help them and support them along the way to coming to full licensure. More and more of our rural districts are hiring folks who are not yet fully licensed. The goal being we will support them and help them along the way as best we can toward a full license. Recruitment student pipelines. There are some districts, and it's happening in some of our rurals, where there's a kind of a rebirth or a new venture into teacher cadet programs or high school students, even some exposure at the middle school level to the joys and wonders of teaching, and really send out the motivating message and help kids find a ways where they can get a taste of that at a little bit earlier stage. Tied in with the ICAP plans, that provides kids a little bit of a framework where they can look and study and learn what kinds of courses or what kinds of planning might lie ahead for their career. And we also want to see what we can do about developing our leadership academies, as Sean mentioned, which could involve principals as well as building leaders. And these are teachers who would, without, as you said, David, not have to necessarily leave the classroom in order to take a leadership role in their schools. And there is also an interest, a growing interest based on much need that we to help our people develop in the cultural diversity area. Trainings that can be provided preferably together on regional basis if necessary, or in the school, to have a special time set aside for our staff people to learn about what this new, for some, this new phenomenon of so many English learners coming in at a fairly rapid pace. So those are the things, and along with the push for early childhood education, and Colorado has one of the most appreciated and lauded early childhood coordination programs of our neighboring states. Utah has communicated with us time and again how much they appreciated the work we have been doing around early childhood education and looking at really making sure our quality programs are in place in a way to help those programs develop further. So those are some of the highlights. CDE, I will say real quickly here at the end of that, is we have a new website. It's called the Teacher Educator Talent website. We've kind of changed the little terminology, but educator talents, and that's what we're all focused on at the time. And it has its own website on the CDE website and has lots of good links for some resources. Regular newsletters are put out about what the activities are around that, and I would invite all of you to make a part of your reading time every day. 5 minutes on the Educator Talent website to just help all of us follow along what we're doing, as well as newsletters.
Thank you so much, Jane. We are at the end of our hour. So, and I'm sorry for everybody who didn't get to speak more. I do want to say, Anita or Sean, if you have a last sentence, if you'd like to say it now.
I guess what I would like to say about the funding and retention question is, teachers, I think, don't go into the profession of teaching for money, but at the same time, it's amazing to me that Colorado is last in the country in terms of compensation for teachers, and
it's not.
It's not?
No.
We're not at the very bottom.
Okay, well, we're pretty close.
We're way down there, but we're not at the very bottom.
Good to know.
I think that it is an important question to look at in terms of retaining teachers and looking at what kind of incentives do we have to bring in new teachers to the profession, especially, I don't know what kind of conversations go on in terms of looking at the millennial mindset, but the older teachers are retiring and leaving, and newer teachers, younger teachers are coming in, and they just have different priorities. They have a different work ethic. Everything is different. And I see that every day at my school. And what are we doing to address that in terms of having a different workplace. How can a teaching world work for the new values and new ideas that are coming in?
Thank you. Sean, last words, and then I will close up.
So one of the things that I've seen over the course of this last year is I've seen a lot of excellent educators all across our state doing absolutely amazing things, oftentimes in spaces where they have the autonomy, the freedom to be creative and to bring their passion into the classroom. And I think that if we could figure out how to make that a more standard approach to education, I think that we would do a better job in terms of retaining as well as attracting teachers. And if we could share those stories in a more consistent and positive way across the state of Colorado, then I think that we could inspire the next generation of educators to come into the classroom. And so if we could work on that somehow, that would be something that I think could be really powerful.
Great. Thank you all. Thank you, Katie, David, Jane, Brent, Julie, Sean, Anita, everyone. Thank you so much for this. We had other parts of question 2 that we didn't get to, and we'll share the policymakers' responses to that question on our website, as well as Senator Gardner's video. So you'll be able to see it. As Nancy mentioned, the webinar was recorded, and it will be posted on our website, which is www.coascd.org. And we'll also post the teaching reflections on the questions we didn't get to once they've reviewed the policymakers' results. And we thank you all for joining this live event, this first live event we had. This was just absolutely fantastic. We plan to continue our efforts to connect with policymakers, invite you to share your thoughts about policy and its impact on the classroom by writing a blog, newsletter article for us, participating in future policy-related events, and just be sure to check our website as well for details. So thank you all, and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.